Welcome to GothCast, episode 20. I'm Dr. Sanders.
And this is Robbie Gore. And today we're going to be talking about a band from the industrial music scene. And I know what you guys might be thinking. This is a goth podcast, so why are we talking about an industrial band? Well, the industrial music scene is actually, it's an area of contention in the gothic community. There are people who think that it should not be talked about at all, and there's people who think that it belongs alongside goth and is maybe even part of goth culture.
Yeah.
However, I think the main thing to pay attention to is that while they are certainly, I would agree, separate genres, industrial music and gothic music both influenced each other heavily during the periods of time that they were going on, and a lot of gothic bands that would continue to release music as the industrial scene came on would start to incorporate industrial influences, and many industrial bands that would come later would draw from goth bands and those types of sounds. And so there's lots of mixing and merging, and that's why today, even at goth clubs, you're going to hear industrial music, or vice versa. An industrial club, you're going to hear goth music. And there's lots of fashion
Crossovers.
Yes, lots of fashion crossovers.
Yeah, and that's something I think is obviously very important to address right in the beginning of this podcast, because Skinny Puppy is one of those bands that actually a lot of goth people are really into.
Yes.
And, less so with, say, a band like Ministry, which is a little more hard rock oriented in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Although, man, some of their albums are great. I really actually super big fan of With Sympathy. I got that on vinyl not that long ago, and I was really happy. But there is definitely a lot of crossover, especially in the beginning, because a lot of, like, say, synth pop bands, they kind of dabbled in industrial sounds. And, obviously with goth music, you had a lot of really popular bands, even like Sisters of Mercy, using drum machines and
synthesizers.
Yeah,
and,
a lot of these same kind of instruments, and kind of using them in a similar way. And of course, you have one of the biggest ones, which is 9 Inch Nails. And I know that a lot of people who are into goth don't really consider 9 Inch Nails obviously that much of a goth band, or they may only like to lump in, say, their first 2 albums or something like that.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that a ton of people who listen to gothic music listen to 9 Inch Nails, which is also like an industrial band. But Skinny Puppy is one of the bands where really it kind of cemented some of the tropes that we see with industrial music. And
definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most raw sort of sounding of the industrial bands, because they weren't pulling from a ton of stuff. They were kind of just making it up as they went to some extent. And I just think it's a very important band to talk about, and it is one of the bands that we see as a stepping stone to where a lot of goth would kind of go in the 90s.
Yeah, definitely. And I think part of the reason that, Skinny Puppy really has kind of that raw sound and sets up, like a lot of, they're kind of like exploring what is going to be industrial music, is because they are really pretty early in the scene. I mean, so industrial music kind of came on the scene in, like the mid to late 70s with, industrial records happening, and bands like Throbbing Gristle being a big part of that whole movement happening.
Yeah.
So Skinny Puppy forms in 1982. They're from Vancouver in British Columbia, and they are definitely an industrial band, but there is a lot of dark imagery and dark lyrics, and I think that's why they definitely appeal to a lot of people in the gothic community.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to talk about, if you're not into industrial music going into this, I don't think that actually Skinny Puppy is the best band to start with. I'll say that right off the bat. I think Skinny Puppy is really great in what they do. I love the imagery that they use. I love kind of the way they mix everything together, and the samples that they use are actually really cool. But it's definitely, for being one of the first bands to really dedicate themselves to this kind of music, it is very, very aggressive and very, very harsh. Especially the albums that we're going to be talking about today, which is their first 4 official albums. And so I know, like, it's hard to recommend people music that's a little bit less mainstream, obviously. You know, like if you're talking The Cure, you're like, oh, listen to Disintegration, or you're talking, you know, a lot of goth bands, you can do that. But with industrial music, it's a little bit trickier because every single industrial band does it a little bit different. They kind of wear their influences a little more strangely. Some are noisier, some are more straightforward. Skinny Puppy is definitely one of the most experimental ones, just because they're kind of figuring out their sound.
Yes, and they're definitely very much at the forefront of industrial's growth and peak and rise to popularity.
Yeah, maybe not the best band to start with. I would say find those crossover bands.
Yeah, honestly, like Nine Inch Nails is a hard band to place, but I will say I think that honestly for a lot of goth people, they're a good kind of introduction to what kind of, you know, industrial bands might sound like, because, you know, there's tons of industrial influence on Nine Inch Nails records, but they're definitely dark enough that goth bands are really into them, and they definitely have more of that, you know, melodic song structure that you see in goth music that sometimes is evaded in industrial music. So they might be a good band to start with. However, if you're already familiar with industrial music and you are perhaps a veteran of the goth scene or looking for something new, I think Skinny Puppy is definitely a band worth checking out. And so we're going to be talking about them today.
Yeah. And so we're going to be doing their first 4 official releases. Now, Skinny Puppy is an industrial band, so they have a lot of EPs.
Yes.
I mean, people who listen to a lot of industrial music will probably get that. Like a lot of these bands, they have a lot of extra releases outside of main albums.
Yeah, they're part of the whole cassette culture and like trading of tapes. And so because of that, a lot of EPs get recorded because you can fit less stuff.
Yeah, so their first official release, the first 2 were EPs. So it's Back and Forth and Remission, both in 1984. Pretty sure most of the songs have been re-released, especially with Remission. But the first official album, like full-length album that they did, was Bites. And this is inside of 1985.
Bites was also re-released in 1993 on CD with additional content, which was performed by Hella Death Day, which was a pseudonym that they used while they toured as an opener for the band Chris and Cozy.
It's funny. I've said multiple times on GothCast that it's kind of funny how stuff from the first album, even if it's not the most commercially successful in a band's career, a lot of times with these industrial and goth bands, just anything kind of dark or kind of culty, not like religious-y, but you know what I mean, kind of something that's a little bit...
a cult classic type thing.
Kind of things. It always seems like the first albums are the most popular in terms of, you know, maybe like the single or a video or anything like that.
Definitely.
And for Skinny Puppy, it's funny because on the first album, the first song, Assimilate, is probably the most well-known song, at least, you know, today for social media, for YouTube, for anything like that. That's always what comes up, and it's like a lot of things on the first album.
It's definitely true. I find that with, you know, just subcultures in general, because you have a lot of bands that kind of fade out of popularity, I think that people tend to, when they look back, gravitate towards their original content.
I think that that's pretty true. But for this album, it's a little strange, I'll say, because when it was released, there's 2 very distinct versions of this album. So there was one release for like Canada, and I think it was like North America, and then there was one Belgium.
Yep.
And so it's hard to distinguish what track listings are for which, because basically anytime you're going to buy it now, it's going to have all the songs on it. So if you're wondering which version we're talking about, we're basically talking about all the songs that were on both versions. And there is overlap, of course, like Assimilate, The Choke, Blood on the Wall.
They're actually pretty close. I think
Tomorrow's not on.
Yeah, Tomorrow's not on the Canada release, and Icebreaker is not on the Belgium release.
Yeah, and the Film is only on the Canadian version. Yeah, but so anytime you're going to see this album now, whether it's on Spotify, whether it's on CD or anything like that, it's 99% of the time going to have all the tracks from both versions.
Yeah, it's probably going to be the CD reissue.
Yeah.
Which is a 17-track album.
So getting right into this album, I think Bites is a pretty good album. And it's got a few flaws, but it is kind of one of those albums where you have to think about what time it was made, and it's pretty astounding for that.
No, I definitely agree with that. So they're definitely trying a lot of new things, a lot of different things that would really set the stage for industrial music and for a lot of things that goth bands would do later. And that's experimentation with using like sampled voices and sounds and different noises and things like that. And also like sequence keyboards, filter knobs on a synthesizer while you're performing. A lot of things that would go on to influence even like things like DJ culture and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Industrial music is pretty hard to describe unless you're actually familiar with it, because a lot of people would say, and I think I said this when we're doing the Rosetta Stone episode, but industrial music does tend to be very noisy. And what I mean is that it tends to be extremely layered. There tends to be a lot going on at any one time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the instruments that a band could play, like, say, guitar, bass, drums, or anything like that. They could put 5 layers of keyboards for a certain part. You know, if they don't have to recreate it live, like a lot of industrial bands, they will write songs and then kind of figure out what they're going to do when it gets to performing it live and use like backing tracks or anything like that. So for this release, there's not an insane amount of layering like we're going to see on their later albums.
Yeah.
But it's definitely here, especially with the use of sound bites and everything like that. It does have a lot of the elements of industrial music and where electronic music would be going in the future.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's also interesting, and I think part of the reason why it would go on to influence, you know, like goth records and goth bands would influence industrial music is because while industrial music is an electronic genre, it grew out of, you know, electronica and things that came out, like music that came out of Germany, Berlin, in like the 70s. However, it is much more kind of avant-garde in its approach.
Oh, and I absolutely think so.
So like in the same way that a band like Bauhaus, you know, released, you know, something like Bela Lugosi's Dead, which was very avant-garde for, you know, like a post-punk band. I think that Skinny Puppy was very avant-garde for an electronic group. And so I think that really helped shape the scene. Yeah,
I definitely would agree with that. They just seem to approach music without the limitations that you see with so many other bands. And it's really refreshing. I mean, it almost does remind me sort of that like Bauhaus way, in that they would take a straightforward kind of rock song or guitar riff and then alter it until it's something a little more strange. Especially on like The Sky's Gone Out, you know, where they just tend to kind of mess with the guitar sound and just loop it and have all this crazy stuff and like reggae influences and pop music. And yeah, it's just with industrial, you have a lot less of apparent influences. Yeah. Which, you know, I mean, that's always cool to hear something that doesn't sound like anything else. And Bites definitely has that sort of sound. I mean, it's very, very unique. And I'll say that the problem with this album, I mean, not necessarily a problem, but one thing you may notice listening back to it today is that it definitely doesn't have the sort of range that you would expect out of an industrial album nowadays.
Yeah, definitely.
So a lot of times the bass and, you know, kind of like the throbbing bass and the drums and stuff are very, very in your face. They're pushed very hard and they're very usually like dynamic. But with these releases, you got to think about the time. I mean, you couldn't really do a ton of stuff like that. And so what they try to do is rely more on the ambience and the aggression of the music.
Definitely.
As the backbone for what this album tries to do.
Yeah, and industrial music in general is so much more fixated around like the idea of rhythm, and so it really is dance music. And as aggressive of an album as this is, they really are paying attention to the way like patterns are played and the way they syncopate with the rhythms. And it's a very danceable music. Like you could easily get on, you know, like a dance floor and move around to this music.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the points. In fact, I would say if this wasn't another type of music and it wasn't Skinny Puppy, I would actually be mad that this album is really repetitive. Yeah. But the whole point of it is to be a kind of droning, danceable, aggressive piece of work. I mean, that's really what a lot of this is. And, if you're used to some of the later industrial music, this will actually probably seem more repetitive than a lot of that stuff is.
Yeah.
But that's because they tried to take it and kind of make it more radio friendly.
Yeah.
This is really pure, like, industrial.
This is where it all started, and I think it would definitely go on to influence, like DJ culture and like, DJs, mixing things like goth records with industrial records and splicing them live.
Yeah.
And that whole like looping things, and just a lot of that was built around repetition, and like you always have repeating samples and ideas that are replayed, and the idea is just to keep people moving on the dance floor. So industrial definitely catered to that idea. And at goth clubs today, most of the DJs are very much influenced by industrial music.
Absolutely.
And yeah, you have usually a lot of industrial music being played at goth clubs now, with maybe goth bands that have like samples taken from them, kind of like spliced into industrial songs, or like live mixing of drum machines with like synth and maybe some samples that they're throwing in. So I think that's really where industrial had a big influence on goth in current culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people who go to goth clubs now would say that there's a lot of industrial music being played. Yeah. And it's nothing against it. In fact, that might be a whole conversation for another time. But talking about Skinny Puppy song by song is not really, how we usually do it, where we pick out certain songs and different elements. It's not really the best way to describe these albums, because if you just pick a song, it doesn't really represent what industrial albums are about. They're more about kind of the mood of the whole work, because it almost seems like a lot of industrial music, especially early in 1980s kind, a lot of it is more about I don't know how to explain it. It's almost like a one giant song that's split up into sections.
I know exactly what you mean. I think that part of the problem is that people expect you, because how most people review albums today is track by track. However, with a lot of electronic groups, who are influenced like by bands like Kraftwerk, that kind of music is really based around just keeping the momentum going. And so, yeah, you might have technically another song starting, but it might often be based on something that they already did earlier in the record. And it's kind of meant to just be one long soundscape that you can keep moving around in, rather than to be very distinct and separate songs.
Yeah, that kind of just describes it pretty well.
Yeah.
As far as actually particular songs that I do like, or at least songs that have elements that I do like, I would say the Deadlines. By the way, I like that, Deadlines.
Yeah.
I really like what they do with that one. In fact, Nine Inch Nails has said that they're very influenced by Skinny Puppy. Yeah. In fact, we'll get to that on a little bit later with some of the other albums, but that'll come up. I do like the sound of it, but you can definitely see that already sounds like what the 90s industrial is going to sound like.
Yep.
Minus very catchy vocals. One of the things that Skinny Puppy does is they play around with what vocals should do in songs. So Ogre tends to almost do like chanting or poetry over kind of it.
There's a lot of spoken word that happens on these albums.
A ton of spoken word. And it really works for it. In fact, it works better on some albums than others, I'll say. For this one, it's a little bit raw. Like, it's a little clumsy.
Yeah.
But, that just kind of makes sense for how early it is. But the fact that they were trying to do it already this early shows that they were just like, screw whatever, music is supposed to be. Yep. Like, let's do let's do spoken word over driving drums and keyboards.
Yeah, did chord progressions that don't follow diatonic transitions and all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, but then Tomorrow, I love the sound of the instrumentation on it. I think it's really great. I love the keyboard sound. And the other one that I really love the keyboards is the song Film. But the reason that I like it is because you can totally tell that this album takes the most influence from like New Order and Depeche Mode whenever they're using like keyboard samples.
Yeah.
Or like, kind of choosing what they're going to be, or maybe they use the same kind of keyboards or something. But especially with the song Film, the keyboard literally sounds like New Order's samples that they would use. And I think that that's really funny.
Yeah, I think a lot of that honestly is due to just what was available on the synthesizer market at the time. So like a lot of these bands were using the same synthesizers, and so you had, synths like the Juno 106 was a big synth at the time, and the Korg MS-20 was a big deal, and like you had lots of bands like using the same kind of synthesizers, and so a lot of times they had some patches that they might have been using that might have been similar.
And if anybody thinks I'm crazy, listen to the song Film, then listen to New Order's Temptation, which is one of my favorite New Order songs, by the way. Not the standard version. There's like a remix version that I like a lot. But listen to those two and tell me it doesn't sound similar. I just, if you're just like, what? Skinny Puppy, New Order, they're not even like similar at all. But listen to Film and then listen to Temptation, and I totally see like a comparison there.
Yeah. It's funny. I think it's almost kind of cool that all the tracks from the two releases are in circulation now.
Yeah.
Because there's different ones from like the two LPs that I kind of like. Yeah. And I kind of wish that they were on the same thing.
I mean, we notice that all the time because we listen to so much from these bands.
Yeah.
Like, I still think that the versions of The Mission's God's Own Medicine, how they have all songs on 3 EPs.
Yep.
I still think those songs should have been included on like a different compilation or something like that. I mean, the first chapter has some, but doesn't have all of them.
I definitely agree with that, and that's why I bought my EPs, because there were so many like little trinkets hidden away in the EPs that just got lost, for albums.
Exactly. Oh yeah, and then the last thing I wanted to mention about Bites as an album, already we have a ton of sampling from movies, from shows, from anything, One of the samples, the main sample that's on the song Basement, is from Legend of Hell House that we reviewed.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah. And it's when they're doing like the seance where she's trying to contact him and trying to contact the ghost, and she goes into his voice where he's like, instead of her being like, hey, she's like,
I remember that.
You all need to get out. That clip is in Basement. That's the sample in Basement, and it's so weird that we chose Legend of Hell House at random for a movie to review. We're just like, oh yeah, that looks cool. And then when we're doing this episode, it's sampled on this album, on the album Bites.
Yep, it's definitely a weird coincidence.
Yeah, and if you actually want to see where all the samples come from, some guy made a great compilation, I think it's on Vimeo, of all the samples that were used in every Skinny Puppy song. It's like 5 parts or something. It's really cool.
Yeah. If I'm going to say anything negative about this album, I will say that I think that it's a great start for them, but I think it is a little bit of a harsh album and kind of a hard listen to if you're not used to industrial music. I commend them for this album, but I will definitely say some of their later stuff I like a bit more.
Yeah, I would agree with that. While it does do a lot of really good things and really establishes what they would be doing for the next few albums, it's a little aggressive for people who are not into this kind of music. Like, if you're used to even, I'm trying to think of like a harsh gothic, even like listening to Bauhaus, which tends to be a little bit more aggressive than, say, Sisters of Mercy would be, or The Cure.
Yeah.
I would say almost like that's not even enough for you to be...
I don't think it's anywhere near enough.
So just be aware that when you're going into this, you're going to have somebody who's basically like really aggressive on the mic. And
I think you almost have to be used to like, I don't know, like something that's as aggressive but in an entirely different way is perhaps maybe like thrash metal or something. Like,
I don't know. Even that, like, metal tends to follow, the 4/4 time of like rock and roll in the same way.
It does.
It almost like, I feel like the thing that will throw people off the most on this is that it doesn't really follow those structures.
It still kind of does. You definitely have, like, the drums always keep to hitting on 2 and 4 kind of sound for the most part, but the keyboards move in and out of time signatures, and they definitely play around with that a lot.
Yeah, that's Bites.
Yep.
So this is going to be our new segment for this episode. And what better way to start any new segment than with some Vincent Price?
Yep. Can't go wrong with that.
Yeah. And so one of the things I want to start off, and actually I have a copy of this now, because they reprinted this book. So Vincent Price and his wife Mary had written this book of recipes in the 1960s, 1965, and it was like all these crazy recipes from different restaurants and different places they had been, and like recipes that they had maybe changed and had liked.
Yep.
And so because it was a Vincent Price item, it's a cookbook with Vincent Price in it.
Yeah.
I mean, published by Vincent Price. It was like super expensive for the original copies of it.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I would want it. Like,
yeah, that's how all that stuff works.
yeah, and it's hard to find like a copy of it that isn't really falling apart.
Yep.
And so Vincent Price's daughter Victoria, she added like a little preface to it and then had it reprinted. And this thing is like a beefy book. I mean, this thing's huge, but it's really cool that you can get it. So it's a cool recipe book, and it even has like reproductions of like different menus, and even has like the old prices. So it's like really funny to see like the prices of food back then.
Yeah.
It was like $3 for like an insane amount of food, or like like roast duck for like $6.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. I will say that if you actually want to cook some of these recipes, it is, written before, like we had like food processors and like we use processed food, so a lot of stuff's supposed to be like done by hand, or even some of the ingredients I find are like
obscure.
Huh?
Obscure.
Yeah, they're a little obscure, or I think like the cholesterol and stuff in some of them.
Yeah.
Is like a little insane. So basically, like, I don't know, especially like any of the desserts and stuff, you're just like, my God, like put a stick of butter in the pan. You're like,
that's definitely how people cooked in the 60s.
Yeah. And so, but I think some of them are supposed to be like healthy. This is supposed to be like healthy food to some extent.
By their standards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that this was reprinted. So if you're into cooking and you're into like horror or like kind of random obscure things, I mean, the Vincent Price cookbook is like, should be right up your alley.
And even if you're just a Vincent Price fan, like, it's a great thing to add to your collection.
Yeah. But yeah, the full title is Mary and Vincent Price, A Treasury of Great Recipes. So I picked it up recently, and it's ridiculous. It's pretty cool, though.
Yeah.
They'll be grossed out by all the food.
Some of us like food, Donnie.
Ugh. And then in other Vincent Price news, I just wanted to announce this one because I think the Vincent Price cookbook, that's a little bit older, but I think they're doing another reprinting of it, so it's a little bit more affordable.
Yeah.
But this is some more Vincent Price news that I just happened to find right around this time, and I usually keep up with anytime there's going to be a Blu-ray or DVD release of like Vincent Price films, because unfortunately a lot of Vincent Price films end up in that kind of like weird area where they get released on a lot of those like 4 movies in one collection, or so usually the quality isn't that great.
Yeah, there's not a lot of great dedicated collections.
Yeah. And like the House on Haunted Hill is like, that's public domain, so you're gonna find a lot of really bad copies of it.
Yes, you are.
But for Vincent Price collectors, if if you're really into his movies, the Vincent Price collections have been coming out on Blu-ray recently, over the last like 2 years. And the first one, I gotta say, is pretty good. So, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of Red Death, The Haunted Palace, Fall of the House of Usher, The Abominable Dr. Phibes, and Witchfinder General. A lot of those are really good movies, right? Pit and the Pendulum's amazing. Mask of Red Death is amazing. The Fall of the House of Usher, basically anything that's like Edgar Allan Poe is great. And then Abominable Dr. Phibes. That was the first collection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So great. You're like, man, like, probably all of them are going to be really good, right? Then the second one comes out, and we have slightly unnecessary titles. So we have House on Haunted Hill, which, you can get that in a million different ways.
Yeah.
You have The Raven, which is good. You have The Return of the Fly, which is okay.
Yeah.
You have The Comedy of Terror, the Last Man on Earth. I think it's a really good movie.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have Dr. Phibes Rises Again, and I don't understand why they couldn't put both Dr. Phibes movies on one collection. Doesn't make any sense to me that they would split it up.
Yeah, I don't. I think a lot of that stuff just comes down to like movie rights and.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep.
But I did want to say, so the point of this is basically like, after the first one, it's like those are okay, right? And after the first one, like the first one's like, man, those are some classic movies, right?
Yeah.
Second one, you're like, oh, it's okay. They're coming out with the third one. It's coming out February 16th, right? And I feel like their movie choices are getting a little bit more obscure and not as good. So it's Master of the World, Tower of London, Diary of Madman, An Evening with Edgar Allan Poe, and Cry of the Banshee.
Yeah.
And while they do include a lot of like bonus content, I just am like, wow, they're not choosing like AAA titles anymore. And Vincent Price has a lot more like really good movies.
Yeah.
But some of those are not them.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that. But it is kind of cool, though, that you can have some of his, less popular stuff or stuff that probably wouldn't normally get released in a collection. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I just noted that, like, it does seem to be kind of the trend of these collections is to, like, come out really strong first.
Yeah.
And then, like, 2, 3, 4 releases later. It's not that you're getting, like, you are getting more obscure, obviously, but then even though there's still those really good movies out there, it's like they're not on those collections for whatever reason. You know, probably money rights or everything like that. I just don't understand why they could get the rights to Abominable Dr. Fives on the first one, and then you have to buy the second DVD, the second, like, collection, Volume 2, to get Dr. Fives Rises Again. Like, I don't understand it. While those movies are like it picks up exactly where the first one left off. Doesn't make any sense for it to be on a different collection.
I definitely get that.
That's my rant. Trying to gouge me on the Vincent Price collectibles.
The world of movie business.
Yeah. So that's my Vincent Price news. And then in other news...
Yeah, so our last piece of news is just kind of... It's not so much news as it is a recommendation from us.
Yeah.
But we came across an Etsy store called Last Craft that sells a lot of really cool like candles and like tarot cards and things that I think a lot of Gothic people or people who are fans of Gothic stuff would appreciate. And not all of it on there is, strictly goth, but there's definitely a lot of it that is goth influenced and a lot of post-punk influence on there.
Yeah.
And so they've got things like Robert Smith candles and, David Bowie candles and, Morrissey candles, Susie and the Banshees. In fact, they have an entire tarot card deck that is dedicated to new wave bands. So they're like altar candles, basically. For those of you who don't know what those are like the religious candles that you usually see with like Jesus or Mary printed on them. So they're taking that style of artwork and including like goth bands or like goth figures in the artwork. And so it's a really cool design and it's a really cool shop. And so if you're looking for, some new candles or, maybe some tarot cards or even, just some artwork, I definitely recommend looking at this shop. It's called Last Craft. You can find it on Etsy.
Yeah, I gotta say, I actually picked up a few things from there. I picked up the Robert Smith candle, and I also got the David Bowie stickers. And actually, the stuff is pretty high quality. I actually really like it. And
it is. So each candle's, close to $15. And while that might be a lot for a candle, if you take a look at these things and, the quality of them and the artwork that's done on them, it really isn't a bad deal for what you're getting.
Yeah, and plus it's something that's so niche. It's like cool that it's actually provided anyway.
Yep.
Because you can always go out and make, certain crafts or whatever, but it may take you a while and you may not have the best quality by the time you're done.
Yeah.
The stuff's like pretty good. So
yep.
I really recommend it, and I haven't been disappointed. Everything ships pretty quickly, and yeah, it's always just a really good person to deal with.
I definitely agree.
So that's our news for this episode. It's a whole bunch of Vincent Price. So we had Vincent Price's cookbook being reprinted. Vincent Price Collection 3 is getting more and more awful every time they release a new one. And check out Last Craft on Etsy for some pretty cool post-punk and new wave and even some like cool Morrissey and Smith stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so that's goth news.
Okay, so now we're going to be talking about Mind the Perpetual Intercourse. It's from 1986, so 1 year later. And right off the bat, I actually feel like this album tries to kind of streamline what they were doing on the first one a little bit. It makes it a little bit softer. And I know some people, I feel like I'm going to get crucified for saying this. I don't know. The Skinny Puppy has some pretty dedicated fans.
Yeah.
But it's just an example from this that this album actually has 3 singles that were released from it.
Yep. And one of them is Dig It, which is always cited by Nine Inch Nails as being a big influence on their, like musical sound.
Yeah, well, if you read that and then if you're familiar with the song Dig It or you go to listen to it, I mean, it sounds remarkably similar to what Nine Inch Nails will be doing, only less poppy.
Yep.
As much as I love Pretty Hate Machine from Nine Inch Nails,
Yeah.
it does take a lot of what was done with Skinny Puppy and a lot of, even just a lot of industrial bands and kind of cleans it up. So
I would definitely agree with that statement.
Yeah.
I think that we may get crucified by some Nine Inch Nails fans.
I mean,
but
look, I love Nine Inch Nails, but that's really true. Is that
they're a more radio-friendly industrial band.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't looking like.
I don't think it was intentional to be radio-friendly. Like,
I'll say this. Okay, this is gonna be my only bit on Nine Inch Nails left on this episode because, I just want people to be able to compare some.
Yeah.
Nine Inch Nails from the beginning basically was looking, Trent Reznor basically was looking to make the most aggressive yet accessible album that he could.
Yep.
Whereas with these ones, like Skinny Puppy's albums, even like My Life with Thrill Kill Cult and things like that, that's not what I feel they were trying to do.
No, they were much more trying to just push the boundaries of what music could be, tear down, the walls that people had set up and confinements for what music should be and what it should sound like, and kind of create this new world where, you could pretty much do anything with your music and have a fan base.
Yeah, exactly. And for this one, I do feel that it's a little less harsh than Bites.
I would agree with that statement. Not significantly so, but a little more.
Yeah, I just say, because we obviously listen to these albums a lot. And at first, a lot of these albums, if you're not used to listening to this type of music, will kind of blend together. You're just like, oh, this song is just like noisy. This song is just noisy. But if you are used to listening to industrial music and very aggressive music, I see that they're expanding on the sound from the first album, but actually streamlining it a little bit and making it, in my opinion, actually a little bit better. Now, they have very, very distorted vocals. So Ogre's vocals on this are very, very distorted most time. Usually have heavy reverb.
Yep.
They're usually almost peaked. Almost sounds like he's running it through something with like a distortion pedal.
Yeah, I definitely think he's peaking his vocals. I think it's probably along the lines of something like he's running his mic through like a tube compressor and just like cranking the gain on that thing.
Yeah, and then there's definitely lots of layers and noise and effects to pretty much everything, to the drums, to the guitars, to bass, to keyboards, to everything. It has usually a ton of reverb, and we do have a ton of samples on this one too. I mean, it's pretty much every single album they've ever done, but you do have these songs that I feel have some poppier elements to them. And so the opener, One Time, One Place, I definitely think that song is a lot more accessible than pretty much anything that was on the first album, just in the way the instruments are done. Not necessarily the vocals, but definitely with the instruments and the mixing of the song.
Yep.
It definitely feels like a little more of what probably most people would consider a regular mix to a song.
Yeah. And then just the fact that there are like singles that are well known from this album definitely shows that this catered more to like a broader audience than the last album did. And that's not to say in any way that they, reshaped their sound. They're definitely still Skinny Puppy.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think that things were a little more put together on this album, and they had more time to, flesh out the ideas of what they wanted their music to sound like. Whereas I felt like their first album really was just like this whole experimentation and just see what we can get away with, see what we can do.
I think it works here too. Even songs like Stairs and Flowers, while it uses like a ton of sound clips and layers,
yep,
it's still like a really good song. And I think
that's my favorite from the album.
You think that? Yeah. I think that one actually ended up being a single, which is it did. If you look at that, as you listen to that song, you're like, that's like a single for a band. But for Skinny Puppy, that's like the most accessible thing that they had at the time. And then Love, I love that song because it's really eerie and creepy.
Yeah, Love is really good too.
Yeah, like I said, the vocals on it, like the distortion on the vocals, is like super over the top. But I just like really like the sound because it's so creepy. Like I just really, really enjoy it.
No, I definitely get that.
Yeah, but then of course Dig It too is, like I said, it's amazing.
Dig It's probably like the most popular of the bunch of singles from this album. You should also note that some singles that were produced by this album were produced by the CD reissue. So Chainsaw and Addiction were also singles.
Oh, okay.
And those were on the CD reissue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then one thing I actually want to mention about this one, I did really like the cover to the first album.
Yeah, I didn't either, but
Yeah.
I think I know where you're going with this, so I'll let you say it.
I really like the cover of this album, and it's got a cool design, if you know what I mean. But yeah, the picture actually is from, they took a picture of like a TV that was playing like a porno.
Yep.
And so it's like a still from a porno, and then it's like kind of distorted a little bit.
Yeah, it looks like it's been heavily filtered and like...
Yeah. And so, but it actually is a pretty cool album design. I like it a lot.
No, I think it works really well for the album. I just thought it was fun information to know that because that was actually, a still from, a pornographic film, that was one of the things that was listed on Tipper Gore's list for her parents' music resource center as an example for why they should put parental advisory stickers on albums.
Yeah, man. And then every time they put it on one, it would sell a lot more.
Yep.
Because kids love controversy, man.
Yep.
I guarantee you that made this stuff fly off the shelves. I like this album. I would recommend this album over their first album, Bites, just because it's a little more streamlined. And by a little more, I mean a little more.
Yeah, well, it's funny because this album, just under like its Wikipedia page, like it, in addition to being called electro-industrial like that last album was called, this one is also called post-industrial. And so I think people definitely notice, like a shift in arrangements and kind of more organization.
Yeah. If you actually take a really deep listen to it, you can see a lot of that coming through.
I will say one thing that I forgot to mention about the last album was I thought it was really funny that one of the genre tags for Bites was synth pop.
Yeah. I mean, it uses keyboards and synths, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's pop music, honestly.
Yeah.
I really don't think it's pop music.
It's not. I'm just going to come out and say it's not.
Okay. I won't stand in your way. So that's mine, the Perpetual Intercourse.
Yep.
Okay, so now on to Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate.
Yeah, so this is their third studio album. It was released in 1987.
Yeah, and I gotta say, this album, while it does kind of continue a little bit of what was, kind of structuring songs a little more, not necessarily basic, but a little more melodically, like just barely, this actually is a super dark record.
Yeah, I wanted to come out and say this is definitely, of the albums we're going to talk about today, this is my favorite album because I feel like there's a really good balance between their experimentation, their accessibility, and then just as an appeal to, a goth person, with this being like you said, a very dark record.
Yeah, I actually would agree with that. Of the four that we're talking about today, I think this is probably my favorite too. Instead of it being lyrically just like shadows cast on my face in the castle with a vampire, kind of thing. Not that there's anything wrong with those lyrics. I mean, I love those kind of things. But
yeah,
this one, it just has a very sinister, villainous feel to it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that the lyrics intertwine with the really dark melodies. There's a lot of minor keys in this. And Ogre's vocals, they sit on it almost in a clumsy way. With this album, there's a lot of like spoken words, and it seems like he just doesn't really have a kind of structure to what he's singing or talking about.
I saw a quote somewhere that I thought described it very well, where it was like they said that his vocals on the album were like a spoken word stream of consciousness that just ran across the album.
Yeah, that's really true. It feels like that in a lot of parts in this, but there's just something about this one. I don't know if they were like really depressed or what. But yeah, this even has like that kind of military sound that we would see with a lot of like later industrial bands, where the drums and just the way he sings, it feels like almost like a war song,
No, I definitely agree with that. And this album is, I think, if I was going to tell someone to listen to Skinny Puppy, who is, into goth music, I think I would tell them to probably start with this album, because I feel like this is definitely one of the ones that really appeals to a lot of goth people. It follows, a lot of those, like you said, minor and diminished chord tones, and it just has a very dark, sinister sound about it. And with, the vocals just kind of like carrying over and, the top of the sound beneath it, it really has this eerie feel to it that I think will appeal to a lot of goth people.
There are some things that have changed, at least in the way that they recorded things. I can't remember if the first album had, like, as far as I remember, most of the vocals are either distorted or low in the mix, or, they're manipulated really, really heavily. For the song First Aid on this album, you have a lot cleaner vocals, so they're not like super distorted like pretty much everything that was on the previous album, but they're still really aggressive. Pretty much everything that isn't like distorted or messed up, it's always going to be aggressive with Skinny Puppy. They have such like an anger to the music and a feeling behind it, maybe like something where they don't want to settle. It's pretty interesting. But songs like Addiction definitely get across that sinister tone. And then with songs like Deep Down, Trauma Hounds, that definitely gets that feeling across amazingly. Like, I think they very much succeeded in making a song that seems to have every element in place, and you wouldn't really want to add anything to it or take anything from it. And that's really the first album where I can say that I think they start doing songs like that.
I would definitely agree. And actually, Deep Down Trauma Hounds is probably one of my favorite songs on this album.
Okay.
I also like Shadowcast a lot.
Yeah, that's a really good song too.
Yeah, I think The Mourn is pretty good too. But yeah, just in general, like, I feel like this album, I feel like it really makes things work.
I think it does too. And if you're wondering what my favorite song is, I think it's Addiction.
Addiction's good. It is the single, and there's nothing wrong with that. I didn't
know it's a single.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm so mainstream.
Right. But yeah. No, it's a really good song, and I definitely agree with their choice to make it their single. Like, I think that was a very smart move on their part, because with a lot of industrial bands, I think they had to choose their singles wisely, and where a lot of other bands might just choose whatever their most poppy song is to be the single. I think a lot of industrial bands just chose some of their best songs to be the singles, because they had to fight for an audience, and because they're not putting out pop records.
Yeah, exactly. And as far as the album art goes for this, I actually like it a lot. It kind of reminds me of something that's like almost like cyberpunk, if that makes sense.
No, I was actually going to bring that up. This is I think a really cool album art for them as well. I think I like this one as much as their last album. It's actually an image from The Village of the Damned.
Cool.
Yeah.
An old movie.
Yep.
It's an okay movie.
Yeah.
It's not great. But yeah, I think this album succeeds more so than their previous work, at least in achieving a really defined, cohesive sound. So it's very hard to explain, because industrial music, at least Skinny Puppy's brand of it, isn't necessarily about having structure or anything. It's about the emotions behind it, and the feeling behind it. But I think this one succeeds the most as far as their first albums in achieving like what I imagine they were trying to go for.
This is definitely my go-to recommendation for Skinny Puppy for these first 4 albums.
All right. That's Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate.
Yep.
Okay, and then our last album for today is going to be VIVIsectVI. And this is their 4th official album. And this one kind of takes some steps forward and maybe a little bit back.
I definitely feel like this is much more reminiscent of their first 2 albums than it is of their last one. Like, there's definitely, like you said, some steps forward, but I feel like they kind of moved a little bit back in terms of, like harshness and like trying to experiment more and push the boundaries again. And that's not to discredit this album by any means. I think that was, a bold move to take.
Mm-hmm.
But, with the last album being my favorite of the 4, I have to say I'm not sure I'm entirely happy with the changes that they made on this one.
Yeah, I would say that the one thing that they got with this one really right was the sound in terms of mixing and producing the album. I think it definitely hits that sweet spot, like with drums and guitars and pretty much everything. Even vocals, I think they really nailed it But in terms of like songwriting and structures, I don't know. It's not like dark enough and it's not poppy enough, if that makes sense. And that may be just because Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate is kind of that perfect balance between it.
Yeah.
But it seems like they were kind of going for something a little different with this one. The opener, Dog Shit. Just want to say that's an awesome opening song title. It's super aggressive. In fact, it's probably like, one of the most aggressive things that they've been doing. Just like, just going for it. But it definitely has a more structured feel to it. So it feels a little less raw than, what they had been doing before. And the song's like Who's Laughing Now, which is a great song. That's like seriously a really good song. And I really like it. It's like catchy in a weird way. And it's like pretty much what I think is one of the poppiest songs they did for this era for them.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That song is definitely poppy, but I don't find this album to be particularly that poppy, just in general.
Oh, and I want to say for Who's Laughing Now, there's tons of Evil Dead samples. So
yeah,
just wanted to note that because it's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yeah, you gotta appreciate that one.
This album is kind of weird for me, and it is like by the fourth album. I mean, it's not surprising that they would be having I don't know, like maybe like a little bit of an identity crisis in some ways.
Yeah.
But you still have a lot of really good things that they're doing on this album, like VX Gas Attack. Like, I love the intertwining between, like, the instruments and the vocals and the samples, like how they kind of trade off what's, like, the main component to it.
Yep.
I love that kind of stuff. But honestly, like, songs, I'm using, like, air quotes, like Fritter, it's just, like, ambient noise and samples for pretty much 70% of that track. And, like, I get it if that's what your vision is.
Yeah.
But it's, I don't know, compared to a lot of the other stuff on the album, I just don't feel like it fits in as well as it would have on, say, the first one, Bites.
Well, I think, part of that, too, is originally it was just Ogre and Key who pretty much wrote everything for the albums.
Yeah.
And, like, this album in particular, you got Ogre, Key, Gothel, Ogilvy. I hope I'm pronouncing those names right.
I know, right? That's what I always think.
But yeah, so you definitely have more influence in the band's, song creation. You've essentially doubled the number of people who were originally writing songs for them.
Yeah, it's plain to see that could affect it because there's a lot more going on under the surface with this album, even though it's a lot less busy than the previous ones.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. There's like less stuff you're hearing less music in terms of samples, in terms of like all the stuff, but you're hearing way more in terms of structure and kind of just plotting out what the songs are going to be like.
Definitely. I will say I don't like the album art for this one as much as the last two.
No, I know.
But I think I kind of like it better than the first album's art.
I would say they're on par for me for like...
It is close.
For how much I like them.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't like this one because it just looks kind of generic by today's standards. It probably looked pretty cool like back when it was released, but nowadays it just looks kind of generic.
Yep.
But yeah, so that's VIVIsectVI. Overall, I think it's an okay album. It's definitely, I think it's kind of better than their first album, at least overall.
I would agree.
But let me put it this way: but the best songs on Bites trump this album as a whole. Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense.
Yeah. And then as far as like my favorite, it's obviously Cleanse, Fold, and Manipulate. And I thought Mind was like a pretty good album. Like I thought it was better than the first one overall.
Yeah.
But man, it's hard to beat some of those singles from each one. I hate being, the person who's like, oh, well, the singles from this one or like, the best songs off this one make this album better.
Yep.
But I don't know. If you don't do that, it's really hard to compare these albums. They're probably all on like the same level because they all experiment with the sound in different ways.
Yeah, and I don't want to take a shot at this album too much because it's not a bad album, but I will say nothing on this album stood out to me quite as much as things did on their previous albums.
Yeah, I would say Who's Laughing Now and Dog Shit were my favorites off of this album. And they're like really good songs, but
yeah, I definitely agree.
But yeah, like I don't know, the other stuff that I just don't care for on here as much. So that's how Skinny Puppy would end their fourth album. Is it's like an improvement, This wouldn't be the last album that they would do throughout the 80s.
Definitely not.
Yeah. And so they would follow this up with Rabies, and we're going to get to that if we do a part 2 of Skinny Puppy. We don't plan on doing like too much industrial stuff. We plan on spreading out these kind of bands a little bit more. Because,
kind of just touching on the bands that we feel really have had an impact on the gothic music scene and are liked by goth music fans and played in goth clubs and things like that.
Exactly. But if people want us to cover Skinny Puppy again or the next 4 albums, then we would happily do it.
Definitely.
I just think that, I'm not like the biggest fan of industrial music. There's definitely some that I love. There's some bands that I absolutely love, and I think that do a lot with sound that is not done in any other type of music.
Yep.
But I'm much, 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 much more familiar with gothic rock and post-punk bands and a lot of even gothic metal I'm way more familiar with. So doing these industrial episodes, we just have to it takes a little bit more focus, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think we just have to prepare a little bit more. I mean, if we need to do like Bauhaus Part 5, I could do it in a second.
Yeah.
Or any of the Peter Murphy stuff.
It'd probably be Love and Rockets.
Love and Rockets so good. Love it, man.
Yep.
They do some interesting things. I'm gonna talk about that when we do Love and Rockets episode. But
and we are going to.
Yes, we are. But I just thought doing Skinny Puppy would be a great way to introduce some people into a really classic, really great industrial band that influenced so many other bands throughout the decades and now, and I still think they're one of like the most aggressive bands like that's ever been around, like ever. Like I think that there's like punk bands and things like that go off of raw energy or anything like that. Skinny Puppy, whenever they do aggression, it's so pure that it almost like riles you up. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, I think a big part of that too is like punk draws a lot of its aggression to like downplaying the technical performance of like the actual songs. So like people are not focusing as much on playing super perfectly, but playing very aggressively and singing very aggressively. Industrial, or at least with Skinny Puppy, their albums are very much put together to be aggressive, but everything is played from a technical standpoint with a lot of precision. These keyboard parts aren't just like thrown together.
Yeah, I agree with that. But that's Skinny Puppy. I hope you all have enjoyed this episode of GothCast, and this is episode 20, just a reminder. And then I just want to remind you that we are part of the Belfry Network. It's a network of podcasts, YouTube channels, blogs, artists, everything you could ever want to see about goth culture.
Whether you're new to the culture or you're a veteran, I think you can definitely find something on there for you.
Yeah. And so you can find it at the Belfry. That's TheBelfry.RIP.
Great URL.
Yep.
And then, of course, we always got to plug our social media. And so we have an Instagram. It's just GothCast. We have a Facebook, GothCast. We have a website, gothcastradio.com. We've got email that you guys can reach us at, which is gothcastradio@gmail.com. And we have a YouTube channel, GothCast Space Video.
Top 2 things I recommend are GothCast Radio, because you're going to be able to find links to absolutely everything that we do. So Facebook, Instagram, it's going to be all through there if you want to find like the quick links.
Yep.
And then, of course, GothCast Video. I mean, that guy making the YouTube videos is amazing.
Yeah. Just a quick reminder to those of you guys who subscribe to the podcast, we are on iTunes. So if any of you guys use Apple devices or, listen to podcasts through iTunes, it would be great if you hit that subscribe button.
Or you left a review. I always like seeing the reviews.
A review would be nice as well.
Yeah. So, hope you have enjoyed this episode. I am Dr. Sanders.
I'm Robbie Gore.
All right, stay spooky.